The year is 1943. Inside a villa in northern Italy, Benito Mussolini sits alone in a dimly lit room. His hands tremble uncontrollably. His eyes, once fierce and commanding, now dart frantically across empty space, seeing enemies that are not there. The man who once stood on balconies commanding millions now struggles to complete a single sentence without his thoughts dissolving into confusion. But this is not just the story of a dictator's fall from power. This is the story of a disease that may have been silently destroying his mind for decades. A disease that was carefully hidden from the Italian people, from his inner circle, and from the pages of history itself. A disease that some historians believe fundamentally altered the course of World War II and the fate of millions of people. What you are about to discover has been buried in medical records, censored documents, and the testimonies of doctors who were sworn to secrecy. The evidence suggests that Benito Mussolini may have been suffering from neurosyphilis, a devastating condition that attacks the brain and can transform personality, judgment, and decision-making capacity. If this is true, then one of the most consequential questions of the 20th century becomes unavoidable. How much of Mussolini's catastrophic decision-making was the result of a diseased mind rather than political ideology? Stay with me, because what we are about to uncover will fundamentally change how you understand one of history's most infamous figures. Before we dive into this hidden medical conspiracy that changed the course of World War II, I need you to do something. If you find stories like this fascinating, stories that uncover the hidden truths behind history's biggest moments, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. We publish deep investigations like this one every week, and the algorithm only shows our videos to a fraction of our audience. Subscribing ensures you never miss these revelations. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Before we can understand how syphilis may have destroyed Mussolini's mind, we must first understand who he was before the disease potentially took hold. In the early Mussolini was someone dramatically different from the dictator the world would come to know. Born in 1883 in the small Italian town of Predappio, Benito Mussolini grew up in a household dominated by his father's fierce socialist beliefs. His father, a blacksmith, named him after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary, and filled his childhood with radical political ideology. Young Mussolini absorbed these ideas with an intensity that would define his entire life, though the ideology itself would eventually transform beyond recognition. In his 20s, Mussolini was a compelling figure. Photographs from this period show a lean, intense young man with penetrating eyes and an undeniable charisma. He became a school teacher, then a journalist, and rapidly rose through the ranks of the Italian Socialist Party. His writing was electric, passionate, and he possessed a genuine gift for oratory that could move crowds to tears or rage with equal facility. But there was another side to the young Mussolini that has been documented by his contemporaries and later biographers. He was a man of voracious appetites, particularly when it came to women. By his own later admissions and the accounts of those who knew him, Mussolini engaged in numerous sexual relationships during his years in Switzerland and later in Italy. This behavior was not merely the indiscretion of a passionate young man, it was compulsive, reckless, and exactly the kind of behavior that, in the early 20th century, put individuals at extreme risk for contracting syphilis. Syphilis was epidemic in Europe during this period. Before the discovery of penicillin in 1928 and its widespread use in the 1940s, syphilis was a devastating and largely incurable disease. It was spread primarily through sexual contact, and it moved through populations with terrifying efficiency. Medical historians estimate that in some European cities, between 5 and 15% of the adult population was infected with syphilis in the early 1900s. The disease did not discriminate between the poor and the wealthy, the educated and the illiterate. It simply spread. The disease progresses in stages. The primary stage begins with a painless sore at the site of infection, which often goes unnoticed or is dismissed. This heals on its own within weeks, leading many infected individuals to believe they have recovered. But the bacteria, Treponema pallidum, is merely going deeper into the body. The secondary stage brings rashes, fever, and other symptoms that can again resolve on their own, creating the dangerous illusion of recovery. Then comes the latent stage, which can last for years or even decades. during which the infected person shows no symptoms whatsoever, while the bacteria silently invades organs throughout the body, including the brain. The final stage, tertiary syphilis, is where the true horror unfolds. In roughly one-third of untreated cases, the disease attacks the cardiovascular system, the bones, or most devastatingly, the nervous system. When syphilis reaches the brain, it causes neurosyphilis, and the results can include dementia, psychosis, personality changes, impaired judgment, grandiose delusions, and progressive neurological deterioration. Now, here is what we know with certainty. Mussolini exhibited high-risk behavior during exactly the period when syphilis was most prevalent. He was sexually promiscuous in an era before antibiotics and before widespread understanding of disease transmission. And later in his life, his personal physicians would document symptoms that are textbook manifestations of neurosyphilis. But I am getting ahead of the story. First, we need to understand how this socialist firebrand transformed into Il Duce, the fascist dictator who would forge an alliance with Hitler and plunge his nation into catastrophic war. The transformation of Benito Mussolini from socialist revolutionary to fascist dictator is one of the most dramatic political metamorphoses in modern history, and it happened with a speed that still astonishes historians. World War I was the catalyst. Initially, Mussolini opposed Italian entry into the war, consistent with his socialist principles. But then something changed. He suddenly reversed position, advocating passionately for Italian intervention on the side of the Allies. This reversal was so dramatic and unexpected that his former socialist comrades expelled him from the party he had helped to build. Some historians have suggested he may have been receiving payments from French intelligence services to promote Italian entry into the war. Others point to a genuine ideological evolution. But what is certain is that this was the first of many instances where Mussolini would demonstrate a capacity for complete ideological reversal that seemed to operate without the constraints of consistency or principle. He served in the war, was wounded by a grenade explosion during training, and returned to civilian life with a new political vision. He founded the fascist movement in 1919, drawing together a coalition of war veterans, nationalists, and those disillusioned with the existing political order. The name itself, derived from the Latin word fasces, referred to the bundle of rods carried by Roman officials as a symbol of authority. From the beginning, Mussolini was constructing a mythology that reached back to the glory of ancient Rome. His rise was meteoric, using a combination of genuine popular appeal, orchestrated violence against political opponents, and the calculated exploitation of elite fears about socialism and chaos. Mussolini positioned himself as the only man who could restore order to Italy. The famous March on Rome in 1922 was part political theater, part genuine threat of violence. King Victor Emmanuel III, faced with the prospect of civil war, invited Mussolini to form a government. He was 39 years old. What followed were years of consolidation. Mussolini systematically dismantled democratic institutions, eliminated political opposition, censored the press, and constructed a cult of personality unprecedented in Italian history. He was portrayed as the embodiment of the Italian nation itself, a genius of superhuman capacity, a modern Caesar who would restore Italy to greatness. Giant portraits of his face appeared on buildings throughout the country. His speeches, delivered from the famous balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, drew hundreds of thousands of people. Children were taught to venerate him in schools. The propaganda machinery was relentless and sophisticated. During the 1920s and early 1930s, this approach seemed to work. Mussolini drained the Pontine marshes, built roads and infrastructure, and created an image of efficiency and progress that impressed foreign observers, including Winston Churchill and other Western leaders who would later become his enemies. Italy appeared to be thriving under strong leadership, but those close to Mussolini were beginning to notice troubling signs. His personal physician, Dr. Cesare Frugoni, who treated him beginning in the mid-1920s, kept detailed medical records that would later provide crucial evidence. These records documented recurring stomach problems that Mussolini attributed to an ulcer, persistent headaches, periodic fevers, and episodes of what the doctor described as nervous exhaustion. At the time, these symptoms were treated as the natural consequence of the enormous stress of governing a nation. But in retrospect, medical historians have noted that these symptoms are entirely consistent with latent-stage syphilis. There was also the matter of Mussolini's increasingly erratic personal behavior. He maintained multiple mistresses simultaneously, including his long-term companion Clara Petacci, whom he would see almost daily. His sexual appetite seemed to intensify rather than diminish as he aged, which some of his biographers have noted as unusual. He became increasingly superstitious, consulting astrologers and developing elaborate rituals. His temper, always volatile, became explosive and unpredictable. Close associates learned to gauge his mood carefully before approaching him with news or requests. Yet through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Mussolini maintained enough control and judgment to effectively govern. His speeches, while bombastic, were coherent. His decision-making, while increasingly authoritarian, was generally strategic. The question that haunts historians is this: when did the disease, if he had it, begin to affect his cognition and judgment? Was it a gradual process, or did it accelerate at a particular point? And most importantly, can we draw a line between specific decisions and the potential progression of neurosyphilis? To answer these questions, we need to examine the period when Mussolini's behavior became truly erratic, when his decisions became increasingly detached from reality, and when those around him began to seriously question whether something was fundamentally wrong with their leader's mind. The year 1935 marks a potential turning point in Mussolini's trajectory, and the evidence for neurological deterioration becomes significantly more compelling from this point forward. In October 1935, Mussolini launched an invasion of Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. The invasion was brutal, marked by the Italian military's use of chemical weapons, including mustard gas, against civilian populations. But what is particularly notable from a medical perspective is how Mussolini conducted himself during the planning and execution of this campaign. Multiple witnesses, including his generals and cabinet members, reported that Mussolini became obsessed with the Ethiopian invasion to a degree that seemed irrational. He would spend hours moving pins around on maps, believing he was directing military operations in detail despite having no professional military training. He made wildly optimistic predictions about the speed of victory that bore no relationship to the actual conditions his forces faced. When his generals attempted to provide realistic assessments, he would fly into rages, accusing them of defeatism and cowardice. This pattern represents a significant shift from his earlier leadership style. The Mussolini of the 1920s had been calculating and pragmatic, willing to listen to advisors and adjust strategy based on circumstances. The Mussolini of the mid-1930s was increasingly unable to tolerate disagreement or accept information that contradicted his predetermined beliefs. This is a classic symptom of the grandiosity and impaired judgment that accompanies neurosyphilis. His personal physicians during this period documented an escalation in his physical symptoms. He suffered from severe insomnia, often going days with only a few hours of sleep. He complained of stabbing pains in his abdomen that would come and go without apparent cause. His hands developed a tremor that he tried to conceal by gripping objects tightly or keeping his hands clasped behind his back. Photographs from this era, when examined closely, show a man who has aged dramatically in just a few years. His face appears drawn, his eyes have lost some of their former intensity, and there is a subtle asymmetry to his facial expressions that neurologists who have studied these images have noted as potentially significant. Then came the decision that would seal Italy's fate and provide perhaps the most damning evidence for the neurosyphilis hypothesis: the alliance with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. In 1936, Italy and Germany formed the Rome-Berlin axis. In 1939, they formalized this relationship with the Pact of Steel, a military alliance committing each nation to support the other in war. This decision has baffled historians for decades because it made no rational strategic sense for Italy. Germany and Italy had been rivals. Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938 directly threatened Italian interests. The Italian military was not prepared for a major European war. The Italian economy was not strong enough to sustain a prolonged conflict. Every rational calculation argued against binding Italy's fate to Nazi Germany's aggressive expansionism. Yet Mussolini pursued this alliance with enthusiasm, dismissing the concerns of his advisors, his military leaders, and even some members of his own family. His son-in-law and foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, kept detailed diaries in which he expressed growing alarm at Mussolini's decision-making. Ciano wrote that Mussolini seemed to be living in a fantasy world, making decisions based on what he wanted to be true rather than what actually was true. He described meetings where Mussolini would announce grandiose plans for Italian military conquests while ignoring basic logistical realities. Ciano noted that attempting to inject facts into these discussions would result in explosive anger from Il Duce, who increasingly saw disagreement as betrayal. This is where the medical evidence becomes particularly compelling. In 1940, Mussolini's personal physician, Dr. Frugoni, consulted with specialists about Il Duce's condition. The surviving medical correspondence, which was uncovered decades later, reveals that these doctors were deeply concerned about neurological symptoms. They documented that Mussolini was experiencing what they described as episodes of confusion, memory lapses where he would forget important conversations or decisions he had made just days earlier, and personality changes that alarmed those who had known him for years. One particularly significant piece of evidence comes from a blood test ordered in 1940. The details were kept secret at the time, but medical historians who have examined the records note that the test results showed abnormalities consistent with syphilitic infection. The doctors could not definitively diagnose neurosyphilis without a spinal tap to examine the cerebrospinal fluid, but such a procedure on the dictator was considered too risky both medically and politically. If word leaked that Il Duce might have syphilis, the resulting scandal could have toppled the regime. So the doctors made a fateful decision. They would treat Mussolini symptomatically, keep detailed private records, and hope that his condition would not worsen rapidly. They were wrong. When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, Mussolini believed he was embarking on a short, victorious campaign that would secure Italy's place as a dominant Mediterranean power. Instead, he was leading his nation toward catastrophic defeat, and the evidence suggests his diseased mind may have prevented him from seeing what should have been obvious to any rational leader. If you are still watching at this point, you are clearly someone who appreciates thoroughly researched historical investigation. Here is the reality. Fewer than 5% of people who watch our videos are actually subscribed to the channel. That means if you are enjoying this investigation and want to see more content that goes this deep into hidden historical truths, you need to hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds, costs you nothing, and it directly supports our ability to spend months researching stories like this one. Plus, we have several more medical mysteries about historical figures coming in the next few weeks that will absolutely blow your mind. Now let me show you how much worse Mussolini's condition became. If there was any remaining doubt about Mussolini's declining mental state, the period from 1940 to 1943 provides overwhelming evidence that something was terribly wrong. The Italian military campaigns during World War II were disasters on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The invasion of Greece in October 1940, which Mussolini launched without adequately preparing his forces or even informing his German allies, turned into a humiliating rout. Italian forces were pushed back by the smaller Greek army, and Germany had to intervene to save Italy from complete defeat. The North African campaign, where Italian forces faced the British, resulted in repeated catastrophic losses. By 1941, Italian forces had surrendered in such large numbers that Germany had to divert significant resources to prop up its failing ally. What makes these military failures particularly relevant to our investigation is how Mussolini responded to them. Rather than acknowledging the failures and adjusting strategy, he seemed to retreat further into fantasy. He continued to give speeches promising imminent victory, even as Italian forces suffered devastating defeats. He blamed his generals, his troops, the Italian people themselves, everyone but his own decision-making. And most tellingly, he seemed increasingly unable to grasp basic military realities. Generals who met with him during this period reported experiences that bordered on the surreal. Mussolini would insist that Italian forces were winning when the generals knew they were on the verge of collapse. He would outline battle plans that made no logistical sense. ordering attacks by divisions that no longer existed or had been destroyed weeks earlier. When presented with casualty figures, he would accuse his generals of exaggeration or defeatism. One German liaison officer wrote in his reports back to Berlin that Mussolini appeared to be living in an alternate reality and questioned whether the Italian leader was mentally fit to continue governing. The physical deterioration accelerated as well. By 1942, Mussolini looked like a man decades older than his actual age of 59. His famous jaw, once thrust forward in defiant poses, now hung slack. His movements became stiff and awkward. He developed digestive problems so severe that he could barely eat, subsisting on milk and a limited diet of bland foods. The stomach pains that had troubled him for years became agonizing. His doctors prescribed increasing doses of medication, some of which may have actually worsened his mental state. But perhaps the most compelling medical evidence comes from documented neurological symptoms that emerged during this period. Multiple sources confirm that Mussolini experienced what we would today recognize as neurological episodes. He suffered from severe headaches that would incapacitate him for hours or days. He had episodes of double vision. His handwriting, which had been bold and distinctive, became shaky and difficult to read. He experienced what his doctors described as nervous crises, where he would become agitated, confused, and paranoid. The paranoia is particularly significant. Neurosyphilis often produces paranoid delusions, and Mussolini increasingly exhibited this symptom. He became convinced that those closest to him were plotting his overthrow. He saw betrayal everywhere. He ordered the arrest and execution of officials who had served him loyally for years, based on nothing more than his suspicious interpretation of their actions or statements. His relationship with his son-in-law Ciano, who had been one of his most trusted advisors, deteriorated into bitter antagonism. Ciano would eventually be executed on Mussolini's orders in 1944, a decision that horrified even many committed fascists. There were also reports of behavioral changes that suggested frontal lobe impairment, another hallmark of neurosyphilis. Mussolini's judgment about appropriate behavior seemed to erode. He would make crude sexual remarks in inappropriate contexts. His famous self-control, the ability to project commanding authority, would dissolve into childish tantrums or tears. Clara Petacci, his mistress, kept diaries that recorded conversations where Mussolini would oscillate between grandiose declarations about Italy's future greatness and despairing admissions that everything was lost. By July 1943, Italy's situation had become untenable. Allied forces had invaded Sicily, and it was clear that the Italian mainland would be next. The Italian military was shattered, the economy was in ruins, and the Italian people were suffering from severe shortages and constant bombing. Even committed fascists could see that continuing the war was suicide. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council voted to depose Mussolini and restore full constitutional powers to the king. It was a stunning repudiation by the very men who had helped him build the fascist state. King Victor Emmanuel III had Mussolini arrested and imprisoned. The dictator who had ruled Italy for 21 years was suddenly and completely removed from power. What is remarkable about Mussolini's response to his arrest is how passive it was. The man who had once commanded absolute loyalty from millions, who had built an entire apparatus of state violence to maintain his power, simply allowed himself to be driven away in a police car without resistance. Some historians have interpreted this as a recognition that resistance was futile, but others have noted that his docility seemed almost dissociative, as if he could not fully comprehend what was happening to him. This kind of blunted affect and inability to respond appropriately to major life events is another symptom that can accompany advanced neurosyphilis. But the nightmare was not over. In fact, for Mussolini and for those unfortunate enough to be caught in the final act of his rule, it was about to get worse. The period from September 1943 to April 1945 represents the complete disintegration of Benito Mussolini as both a leader and a human being. And the medical evidence for advanced neurosyphilis during this final phase is perhaps the strongest of his entire life. In September 1943, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny staged a daring raid to free Mussolini from his mountain prison in central Italy. Hitler insisted on this rescue, not out of loyalty, but because he needed a puppet figure to legitimize German occupation of northern Italy. Mussolini was taken to Germany, met with Hitler, and was then installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a collaborationist state that controlled parts of northern Italy under German military occupation. The Mussolini who emerged from this rescue was, by all accounts, a broken man. Everyone who saw him during this period remarked on his dramatic deterioration. He appeared physically frail, stooped, and aged beyond his years. His voice, once commanding, had become weak and hesitant. His eyes, which had once radiated intensity, now seemed vacant or glazed. Several witnesses reported that he seemed to have difficulty following conversations or would lose track of what he was saying mid-sentence. The German officers who dealt with him during this period were alarmed by what they observed. One German diplomat wrote that Mussolini seemed barely present mentally and that meetings with him were exercises in futility because he could not focus or make coherent decisions. Another German official reported that Mussolini would sometimes sit silently for long periods, staring into space, and then suddenly burst into tears without apparent cause. These reports are remarkably consistent with the late-stage neurological decline seen in neurosyphilis patients. His decision-making during this period was virtually non-existent. The Italian Social Republic was entirely dependent on German support and direction. Mussolini signed documents and gave speeches, but these were largely meaningless gestures. Real power was in German hands. Yet even this puppet role seemed beyond his capacity. He could not maintain consistent policies. He would agree to one course of action in the morning and contradict it in the afternoon. His orders were often impossible to execute or made no sense in the context of actual conditions. The evidence of advanced physical symptoms also became overwhelming. Multiple sources confirmed that Mussolini's abdominal pains became so severe that he was often bedridden. He lost significant weight. His tremor became so pronounced that he had difficulty writing or holding objects. He developed what witnesses described as a shuffling gait, having difficulty walking without assistance. These are all symptoms consistent with the neurological and systemic damage caused by tertiary syphilis. There is also evidence of cognitive impairment that went beyond mere stress or depression. Clara Petacci, who remained with him until the end, recorded conversations that show a man whose grasp on reality had become tenuous. He would make bizarre statements about military situations that bore no relationship to actual events. He would reminisce about his past glories, but with details that were clearly false or distorted. He spoke about plans for Italy's future that were completely fantastical given the actual situation. And perhaps most telling, he seemed unable to understand or accept that Germany was losing the war and that his own position was hopeless. As the Allied forces advanced northward through Italy and Germany itself faced imminent collapse, Mussolini's behavior became increasingly erratic. In April 1945, with partisan forces closing in and the Germans withdrawing, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland with Clara Petacci and a small group of loyal followers. This final flight was characterized by confusion and poor judgment. Rather than traveling quickly and quietly, the group moved slowly and with inadequate planning. They were easily recognized and captured by Italian partisans on April 27, 1945. What happened next is well documented. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by partisan fighters near the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. Their bodies were then transported to Milan, where they were hung upside down from the roof of a gas station in the Piazzale Loreto. Crowds gathered to view and abuse the corpses of the man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades. In one of history's bitter ironies, there was an opportunity after Mussolini's death to definitively answer the question of whether he had suffered from neurosyphilis. An autopsy was performed, and tissue samples were taken, including samples from his brain. However, the autopsy report is remarkably incomplete and focuses primarily on confirming the cause of death. The brain examination was superficial and did not include the kind of detailed pathological analysis that could have detected the characteristic lesions and damage caused by syphilitic infection. Why was such a thorough examination not conducted? Several factors seem to have been at work. First, there was enormous political pressure to move quickly. The Italian partisan movement wanted to establish that Mussolini was definitively dead to prevent any possibility of his supporters claiming he had survived. Second, there may have been a desire, even among his enemies, to avoid revealing that Italy had been governed for years by a man suffering from a devastating and stigmatized disease. The shame of that revelation might have been seen as reflecting poorly on the entire nation. Finally, in the chaos of the immediate post-war period, rigorous scientific examinations simply may not have been a priority. Some tissue samples were preserved and are reportedly still held in archives in Italy. Modern forensic techniques could potentially analyze these samples and provide definitive answers about whether Mussolini had neurosyphilis. However, the Italian government has been reluctant to allow such testing, citing concerns about dignity and historical sensitivity. As a result, we are left with a frustrating situation where definitive proof remains tantalizingly out of reach. So what can we conclude from this investigation? Did Benito Mussolini suffer from neurosyphilis? And if so, did it fundamentally alter the course of history? The evidence, while not absolutely conclusive without modern testing of preserved tissue, is remarkably strong. Mussolini engaged in high-risk sexual behavior during the period when syphilis was epidemic in Europe. His personal physicians documented symptoms throughout his life that are consistent with the progression of syphilitic infection, from the relatively mild symptoms of the latent stage through the severe neurological and psychiatric manifestations of tertiary syphilis. Witnesses across decades describe behavioral changes, cognitive decline, personality alterations, and physical symptoms that align precisely with what medical science tells us to expect from neurosyphilis. The pattern of his decision-making also fits the neurosyphilis hypothesis in disturbing ways. The increasingly grandiose delusions, the impaired judgment, the inability to accept contrary information, the paranoia, and the ultimate complete collapse of executive function all occurred in a progression that matches the expected trajectory of the disease as it attacks the brain. If we accept that Mussolini likely suffered from this condition, the implications are profound. Some of the most catastrophic decisions of the 20th century, decisions that led to millions of deaths and immeasurable suffering, may have been made by a man whose brain was being progressively destroyed by disease. The alliance with Nazi Germany, the disastrous military campaigns, the prolongation of a war that Italy could not win, all of these may reflect not ideology or political calculation, but rather the impaired judgment of a diseased mind. This raises uncomfortable questions about historical responsibility and causation. If Mussolini's decisions were influenced or determined by neurosyphilis, does that change our moral assessment of his actions? Does it matter whether evil decisions result from evil intent or from organic brain disease? I would argue that, while understanding the medical context is important for historical accuracy, it does not absolve responsibility. The structures of fascism, the culture of violence, the persecution of minorities, and the alliance with genocidal regimes were built by many hands, not just Mussolini's. A diseased leader could only cause such catastrophic damage because entire systems enabled and supported his rule. Yet there is a lesson here that transcends the specific case of Mussolini. The concentration of power in single individuals, the construction of systems where one person's judgment cannot be questioned or checked, creates vulnerability to exactly this kind of catastrophe. When we build political systems around charismatic leaders rather than robust institutions, we risk placing the fate of millions in the hands of individuals who may be compromised in ways that are not immediately apparent. The story of Mussolini's hidden syphilis nightmare is ultimately a story about the fragility of human cognition and the dangers of unchecked power. It is a reminder that behind the grand narratives of history, behind the ideologies and the movements and the wars, there are human bodies and human brains subject to disease, decline, and failure. And when those bodies and brains belong to dictators, the consequences can be measured in millions of lives destroyed. The medical evidence was there, documented by doctors who saw what was happening but were powerless to prevent it. The behavioral evidence was there, observed by those close to Mussolini who watched him deteriorate but could not speak openly. The historical evidence is there, in the pattern of decisions that become increasingly detached from reality as the years progressed. What we are left with is a portrait of a dictator whose tyranny may have been amplified and distorted by a disease that was slowly, inexorably destroying his mind. This is the hidden nightmare that history tried to bury. But understanding it, examining it honestly, and learning from it may be one way to ensure that we build political systems resilient enough to prevent such catastrophes in the future, regardless of the mental state of those who lead them.